Welcome to part 3 of our Tinder clone, and in the last video we have got things looking pretty good. So on the left side of the screen we have this matches, and that shows us the users that we have matched with already. And we also have the messages section, but we haven't set that up yet. And on the right side of the screen then we have users that we can click the heart or the X icon on to take an action on that user. So what we want to do now at the beginning of this video is to first let's set up a pop-up feature where when we click on the match tile in our matches section on the left side of the screen, we want to have a pop-up that allows us to send a message directly to that user. So that is basically the core features of Tinder, being able to match with users and send them messages. And before we go too deep into the code, I just want to remind you that if you enjoy this content, to subscribe to the channel and like this video. And if you're interested in learning more about Ruby on Rails, I am releasing a new course in the next couple of weeks. And if you're interested in learning about Ruby on Rails, do check out the link in the description below. So going back to our application now, once our match tile has been clicked, we are wanting to show a div that will overlay on the right side of the screen. So for this we're going to call it conversation, so the ID will be conversation. So if we go over to our browse front end view, so our browse.html.erb, in here we will add a new div that has the ID of conversation. And we'll start to populate this overlay for our conversation with some dummy data. So we will copy the photo layout from our profile bar. I'm just going to copy this image tag and paste it into our conversation window. So in order to make this work, we will temporarily use the first user in this array of users that we are sending to the view. So this will just output some dynamic data. Of course, it's not the right data at the moment, but we will get around to fixing that soon. So we just want to see this pop-up working and showing some real data just to begin with. So we will update the class on our div. So we'll have a row and then we'll have a 12 column layout. So that will be like a top bar section which will have a icon for the user profile, and then there will be a name beside that. And then underneath this we'll have another row, and we will input a this will act as a body area for our conversation window, and we will populate this with a basic message saying that you have matched with this user and how long ago that it is since they've matched with that user. So it's kind of like a welcome message just to start the conversation. Obviously once messages are sent, we won't be showing this next time, but again, we'll get around to that later. We just want to start with a basic message here when the user clicks to show this window. And now that we have that welcome message in place, we can also add a photograph of that user that we're about to speak to. So this will be a bigger photograph. It will be rounded just like the smaller picture of that user, but it just gives you a preview of that user before you speak to them. And then finally, at the bottom of the conversation window, we will have a section where we can send a message to that user. So in here we're going to need to put a form. So that form will create a new conversation and populate a new message. So for now we can just add a temporary form. So this will be updated later, but we're just going to add some dummy data just to see if we can get the layout right first. So within our form we are going to need a text field so that we can input a message. then we'll also need a button so that we can submit that message. And we can also include some placeholder text. So enter your message and press send. And then we'll also add a name for this text field. And we'll have a we'll have a class of form control here. So that's a bootstrap class just for styling elements of the form fields. And then we will also add to our style sheet. So for this conversation, then we will set a width and height, and then we will have a position of absolute, and we can set that to 20% from the right and then 20 pixels from the top of the screen. And then we will add a Z index, so this just layers it on top of anything else that is positioned absolutely. And as you can see, there is no background to this conversation window, so let's have a background color of white, and that will hide the background content behind this conversation window. And now I'm going to style this up a little bit better. So I want this to fill most of the right side of the screen, but I also want it to be clear that it's an overlay so that it can be closed. So in order to do this, I'm going to set up a new partial within the views, and then I will render this partial into this existing view that we have right now, and I will also move that up into the column directly above. And then the next thing we'll do is try to improve these styles to make this fit the full space here on the right. And even when it's down on mobile size, it looks pretty bad right now, so we need to improve our style sheet for this. So I will change this to use a percentage. So now that it is within the column on the right, we want to fill most of that space in that column. So let's use percentages just to fill that. So that just means if we use a percentage and the user has a multiple sizes of screen here are possible for different users based on the size of their laptop or their screen. So if we use a percentage, we can fill that much easier. So I'm just going to tweak around with this until it looks close to what we're looking for. I just want to fill that space and just leave a little bit around the outside. And I will also add some padding here just to give it a little bit of breathing room, the content. And already that's starting to look a little bit better. And now for this welcome message, we want to center align that. And we'll add again some spacing between this content. We'll add a margin here to the bottom. And these again are using Bootstrap. So we're using Bootstrap for the layout, and these are classes that control the padding and margin within the layouts. So using the MT and a number between 1 and 5, we can control the margin to the top. Using the MB, we can control the margin to the bottom. So we're using this to just create some space in our design, make it easier for the user on the front end. So it just looks much prettier, keeps things much cleaner. So we've also added a border. So there's a line here just directly underneath the top section of our conversation window. And then we're adding some padding, again, just to give more space to the design. So there is a lot of front-end design type work in this video, but I think it's important because ultimately the users want to enjoy the experience of using the app. So having some design in there is important. And like most of my videos, my focus is on the full stack. So we do have the front-end work and the back-end work just to tie everything together. And the next thing I'm doing now is I want to include a date here. So I'm just following what it is like on Tinder. So it says on Tinder that you've matched with this user on this date. So I will go ahead and continue to style up this conversation window just to add some more spacing between all the elements. And one thing to mention here while I'm doing this is that like all of these apps that I create on these videos, I normally sell the source code at the end for quite cheap, considering the amount of effort I put into each of these videos. So like the Craigslist clone, the Instagram clone, and the property app clone I have already, I will be selling this on my website for anyone who wants to start a business that thinks that they can use this for whatever reason. So there are many uses for an app like this. It doesn't have to be dating. Maybe it's for buying items. Maybe you want to match with someone for a service or a trade. So there's many uses for this, but if the code is useful to you, it will be for sale on the website. So do check that out in the links below in the description. So looking back at our app, I'm going to add a style here to the bottom section. So just in the way that we did on the top. So we had a top bar, I'm going to have a bottom bar, and I'll just reverse all of these. So we have border on the top, padding on the top, and the margin on the top. And this just helps to separate the content, makes it look a little bit better. And I'm just making these fields a little bit bigger, so the input fields to be a large size. And we can also add some padding on the left and on the right of the button, just to fill it out a little bit more. And I think this is starting to look quite good right now. So it's quite well spaced out. We've got message at the top and the bottom. We've got an image. We've got the date when we matched with that user. And then we've got this form at the bottom. So it looks pretty good. Quite happy with that so far. But we do need to add a button to the top right here just to close this conversation window. So let's add that now. And for this, we are going to use Fun Awesome. So we can use the FA class and the FA times. And that will give us a little X that we can click on. And then we'll float that to the right. So we can see it. It's quite small though. And it's messing up the border underneath. So we'll move that down. So I want to make that a little bit bigger. And I think there's a class for this called FA2X, which doubles the size. So that looks good. And we can change the text color if you want to, so we'll have that text muted. And I'm going to also add a class here called close conversation, and that allows us to style this element further. So we'll add a cursor of a pointer, so that just makes it look like you can click the item, so it's very clear for the user if they're on desktop. And then when we hover that, we can actually change the color of that text. So it's not working here, but I think we just need to add the important class. So I think it's being overruled here, the style, but so we need to add the ampersand. Okay, so that works. So when you hover it, it darkens, and so now we need to actually do something with this once it's clicked, once the user clicks on it. So we can use that within our JavaScript. So we'll do that now. So we can say that once this class has been clicked, then we will run a function here in our JavaScript. And we're just going to grab the conversation window, and then we will just hide that. So that's what we'll do for now. And we can test that out. And that is working. The next thing we want to do is do the opposite of that. Once we click on that match tile, so that user on the left, we want to open this conversation window. So let's try this, and that works. So that's pretty good right now. It's a good start at least. So now that we have the layout in place for our conversation window and the styles in place, let's try to actually load this up with real data. So once we click on that user, we want to make a request in the background to grab the data for that user. So that would be the conversation that has been had, the messages that have been sent between you and that user. So we'll grab that information and then try to bring it back and populate this window that pops up. So I'm going to use an ajax request to make contact with the backend. So we're going to send a message to our controller to grab the information we need. we will send the URL to get profile, and then we'll pass in the account ID. And that would be a post method. So let's set this up in our routes. So we set post, get profile, and we'll pass the ID. Now we'll set the controller. So we can just use the browse controller for now. So in this example, I'm using profile as a method within our controller, and then the name of the route will be conversation. Now you can change this around. Maybe you want to call that conversation instead. Change the method to conversation. It's sometimes naming conventions are a little bit difficult to get right, so you can play around with that to have whatever feels best for you. But for now, I think I'm going to use this conversation method within our browse controller. It might make more sense to have a separate controller for conversations later and move that there, but for now let's just focus on the very basic stuff and get this up and running first. So in here we are selecting the profile of this user, so we're selecting that account based on the ID that's passed in, and if that account is present, then we will return some information back to the browser. So in this case, we just want to see if this is working, so we could go ahead and just render something simple here or log a message. So one thing to note is that we could go ahead and render a partial here, but by default, if we are using JavaScript to call this method, then it will output a JavaScript view with the name of the method. So in this case, we're just going to create the file just to match the method name. So it's conversation, and that's .js.erb. So in here, then we can run some JavaScript that is used within the browser. So in the case of what we're trying to do, then we want to just load up this window, this conversation window, once the user clicks on one of their matches. So in here on the logs, we can see that the actual JavaScript file is being loaded. So that seems to be working, but for some reason we're not getting the output here to the console. So let's see what's happening here. Change that to alert. Still nothing's happening, but it looks like it's loading here. And it looks like what is happening here is, it looks like it's not being loaded as JavaScript, this request in the background. So otherwise the code would be executed, but it is loading the file. It's saying conversation.js, but when you look at the top, the processing by, it's not saying as JS or as JavaScript, which it should be. So it's not really understanding what type of request it is. But before we try to figure that out, let's just hide this conversation window by default on the page loads so that we can test this more. So when we click it, it should be showing here, but it's not registering this as JavaScript. So let's go back to our controller now, and in here I'm going to have a respond to block, and I'm going to set the format to JS, and then once that is loaded, we will run some code for the JavaScript formatting. So let's try this. I don't know if this is going to change much here, but I just want to make sure that everything is set up properly at least. So now once we run this code, we are getting an error, and it's saying about the user. So user.first is not working for us here anymore. So let's go back to our code and refactor that. So we had set that up initially as a kind of dummy code just to get some basic user data there. But now that we are loading a specific user, we want to be using that information. So let's update this to use the profile. So we're using this profile instance variable that we have set in the controller, and we will just pull the data from that. So at least we'll be getting accurate information here once, based on the profile image that is clicked in our matches section. So let's try this out. So back in our browse view, I want to wrap this render within a div, and the reason I want to do that is so that we can update the content of this div later based on what the user clicks. So we'll be updating this with information on the fly later. So we'll use a partial within this then to load data, but initially it's going to be blank. So going back now to our conversation JavaScript. So in here, let's just try to populate this data from the partial, and we will put that into the conversation div as HTML. So we'll use escape JavaScript to do this. And we'll just modify this to be HTML, and we'll copy and paste that inside. So that should load the result of this partial into the div element. So after we've loaded in the HTML, then we can just show that element. So once the content has been loaded in, we'll make it visible to the user. So we still have to figure out what is going on with this JavaScript. We still are not rendering it as JavaScript. So let's have a look at that now and see if we can get this working. So after a little bit of searching, it turns out we need to change the data type here for this ajax request. So if we set it to script, it should be reading the information as a JavaScript request. And again, we are experiencing another issue here. So it's showing a unexpected character, and if you look back at our controller, so it looks like we have made a mistake here. We're trying to render a partial, and really it should not be a partial. It should be the JS file that we're loading. So let's remove that and try again. And we are working this time, so that's fantastic, and it's given the right name, the date, and there's another date here for matching. So one thing that's not working here though is the close button, and the reason for that is that the binding of that JavaScript has happened before that content has actually been loaded. So we need to add some code here to this JavaScript file. So we can combine these two commands just to load the content and show. But if we go back to our other JavaScript file, we can bind the DOM element again with that close button, so that once it's clicked, it will close this window. So while we're here, I just want to move this close conversation, take it out as a class and add it as a div, as a ID instead to this div. And the reason for that is that we will only be using it once, so there's no sense in using a class for it. So classes are more beneficial if we're going to use it multiple times. So IDs are specifically designed to be used once. So let's just update our reference to it, and again we are just binding that click event within our new JavaScript file, and that is working. So that's good. We can open and close this window, but let's have a look at the dates that is being shown here in this window. So this one's a static date right now, so let's update this. So we will use the match. So we'll set a match in our controller, and we'll use a created at timestamp, and then we will use this string from time to populate that information into a readable text format. So let's set our match within the controller, and I'm actually going to go back and update some of this matching code, so we can definitely make it a little bit more optimized. But for now, let's just go with what we have. Okay, so we're going to load a like based on the account ID, which will be our own account, and then we'll use the liked account ID as the parameter that's passed in. And then we will set this match instance variable. So it will basically just grab the first like if there are more than 0 likes that has been loaded. We can see that the date is now loading here, but there's an issue in the formatting. I think maybe I've made a typo on that date, so let's go back to that, have a look. So we can see that the like is being loaded, and we can actually check on the value for this like, and it should be on October. So let's go back to our date, and yeah, we have made a typo on this. So let's reload this, and yep, that's showing correctly now. And there is another date here with the match just directly underneath. So this one, again, we'll just use the match.created at, and we're using time ago in words for this one, so that's 27 days ago. So that's looking good. So that's all working. The next step then will be to get this conversation working. So we'll need to create a new migration for that. So we'll create a table for conversations. So we will include a timestamp here for the conversation. And we'll run this migration. And now we'll also create a migration for messages. So in here we'll have a conversation ID. So that will be a reference to the conversation. And we'll also have a account, which is also a reference. And we'll have a body of text. And then we'll have a boolean of read. So if the message has been read by the user, then it'll be marked as true. So by default, it will be marked as false. So going back now to our migration file. So we're going to modify this a little bit just to make it work the way we need it to. So we'll run a Rails DB rollback so that we can modify this migration file. And I just want to change this to use a reference so that we get the correct indexing. So if we use the reference, we will add and we'll automatically get an index on the column that we're using. We can actually rename this to sender, and then we will have a recipient. So this will also be a reference. And I'm just comparing this against what I have in the messages table. So I'm just checking that everything is right here. And we can include a timestamp for new entries. So when a new entry is added to the database or is updated, we'll get a timestamp for that. And we're seeing an error here when we run this migration. It's saying there's no, it's complaining about the IDs on this migration. So we can take that out and try this again. And we'll add here a reference. So since we are referencing our accounts table here twice, we'll need to use this references at the end of this line just to specifically tell Rails that we are using the accounts model for this. So normally this would happen automatically, but since we have multiple fields referencing the table or referencing this model, that we need to declare it. So now that we have this added, it seems to be working this time. And if we go to our schema file, we can see that the sender ID and recipient ID has been set. So it automatically adds on this underscore ID for us. So now let's go back to our models folder, and in here we're going to add a new model for conversation. And while we are here, we will also add a new model for the message. So message.rb, and create a new class in here for message. So our conversation will have many messages, and once that conversation is destroyed at any point, it will also destroy the messages attached to it. So we can use the dependent destroy to do that. And we'll add a validation here for the uniqueness, and that's going to allow us to create a unique record based on the sender ID and the recipient ID. And in the case of there being a duplicate entry, this validation will be triggered and prevent that from being saved. So we only want to have one record for each of these combinations of sender and recipient. And then we'll also add a scope here. So this scope will allow us to pass in two values. So we can pass in the ID of both users, and then we will check the database to see if there is any conversation already existing between the two users that we are checking against. So the important part of this scope is that we need to be able to check two scenarios when searching for this conversation. So it depends on who has actually initiated the conversation. So whoever initiates the conversation will have the sender ID column, and whoever is the recipient then of that conversation, so the person who is receiving that first message will be the recipient ID. So there'll be two scenarios here where it really depends on who begins the conversation, whether that conversation is triggered or is found or not. So we need to do that OR clause to say to catch both scenarios, basically, depending on who starts the conversation. So moving into our message model, in here we want to say that the message belongs to the conversation, and it also belongs to an account. So the message will have an account ID, so it only has one ID attached to it that belongs to an account. So let's test this out in our Rails console. So when we type conversation.new, we're getting this error here. So it's saying it's an unknown key dependent. So if we go back to our code and have a look and see if we can spot what's going on. We have this dependent on the top line, and it looks like we made a typo here. So let's try this again. And this time it's working. It's able to load a new conversation. So this tests the between scope that we've created. We'll pass in two IDs, and it looks like we're getting a different error here. So undefined method between. So I'm just reloading the Rails console, and once I try this command again, so I'm running the between scope again, and it's telling us there's an undefined variable called recipient ID. Something is not right here. Again, it's probably a typo, but let's try to track it down. Conversation line 6, recipient ID. The spelling looks correct here. Actually, we've made a mistake in the top part. Still the same issue, recipient ID. Oh, okay, we've missed something here, the and. So what now? Perhaps you meant to reference conversations.recipient ID. Recipient ID. Okay. This is frustrating, but it looks like I've created a typo in the actual migration when we were setting this up. So we can see that there is a typo here in our migration file. So I'm going to run a Rails DB rollback and just correct this spelling, as it's going to be very irritating later if we don't get the spelling right. So that's been corrected. Let's run the migration again. And we can try our Rails console again and just run the same command. And you'll see this time that it is working. So So there are no conversations for these two IDs at the moment, but we are not getting any errors anymore. So I'm going to create a conversation directly from the Rails terminal and save it. So this conversation.create, and we'll pass in the sender ID and recipient ID. So just number 1 and 2, so that's using two separate accounts, first two accounts. And you'll see here that I've run the conversation.between again, and it is selecting that conversation. So now I'm going to change it. I'm going to update the sender ID and the recipient ID and just switch those. And if I run this between method again, this scope, it should also select the same conversation even though the numbers are reversed. And it does, so that's working correctly. The next thing we want to do is to get this message box working. So once a user enters a message, it needs to create a new conversation and store it, and it also needs to create a message within that conversation. So let's update our HTML view first, and we'll want to set a form here that can send directly to our conversation controller. And we are using the form with tag here. You could also use the form tag and the form for tag, but form with I think it's a little bit cleaner in terms of the classes and IDs that automatically get added if you use the form tag or the form for. But with form with, it just keeps things really simple, and by default it also uses the ajax approach to send forms unless you tell it otherwise. So it's quite useful in this scenario especially. So I'm just adding the placeholder and the classes that we had on our static form field. So this will be a proper working Rails form now as we finish this. So we'll comment out the other field that we had before, and we'll need to set this message instance variable within our controller, but we'll also need to have a resources set up within our routes file. So that will allow us to create conversations. So we'll create all the routes for our conversations, and then within that we have messages. So a message belongs to the conversation, so it makes sense that we set the routing that way. So back in our controller, I am setting this message to equal message.new, but it seems like there's a conflict of our routing. So we have this conversation route from before, so we'll have to rename this. So rather than it being a conversation, we can call that either get conversation or start conversation. And then also for the method within the controller. So I think maybe the best option is to call it open conversation, as the conversation may already be started previously. So you're opening it again, potentially, or opening it either for the first time or you're coming back to it. So let's try this, and I'm seeing a little bit of a problem here. It's saying undefined method, messages path. So in order to try and solve this, I think we can go back to our HTML and have a think about how we're approaching this. So in this case, we should really be trying to create a conversation, and then from that conversation, then we create the messages inside it. So first, let's set up our conversations controller. And I will just add some of the methods that we're likely to need here. So creating and updating our conversation, and we'll have a private section at the bottom of this controller, and then we'll whitelist our conversation params within that method. We can actually take out the new method here because we've got this open conversation within our browse controller. And in fact, we can probably just take this out and leave it as a create method. So I'm going to set up a controller here for our messages. So while we were doing that, let's set this up. So now let's whitelist the parameters that we can pass to our conversation. So we will require the conversation, and then we will use the .permit to list the fields that we are going to accept. And the important part here is this messages attributes. So we are allowing our conversation to create messages on our behalf. So in here we will have fields for our messages. So we'll record the body and the account ID. We'll have a look at the schema here to see what's required, but it looks like just those two fields. So the conversation ID should be automatically set for us. So going back to our view now, we can change this to be conversation. So call this conversation. So that's within our browse controller, we're setting that as conversation. And then within our view, we will also change that. So now let's add our nested attributes. So we're going to use form.fields_for, and we'll say message, and we'll iterate over the message. So in this case, we're creating message.text field. So that would be the body of our message. And within our controller then, so within our browse controller, we are building this message, and we're building that through the conversation. So we'll just automatically create a new message by default. So once again, having a look at our logs, it's saying here undefined method message, and that's on browse controller line 40. So we need to make that plural. And what is it this time? We are getting a different message now. Undefined message. We go back to our view, and again, I think that should be plural too in this case, but that's not what's going on here. There's something different happening here. Oh, we forgot to add our nested attributes to the model, so we'll do that in the conversation model. Completely missed that previously. So let's try this once more. And since this is a form builder, we'll just append the underscore form here. And I think this is where our message, or where our error was coming from. We named it message, and it should really be body. So the text of that message should be called body. So that has fixed it this time. We'll just have a look at the form. You can see that the fields are being set up correctly. There are nested attributes here. So messages attributes, the body tag is set correctly. So let's try sending this and see what happens. I'm not expecting anything magical here, but it'll help us just debug what we got so far. So we can see that the message has been posted, the conversation has been posted, and the fields are all being submitted correctly, but our conversation controller is not doing anything right now. As you can see that we left that blank previously. So the thing we can do here is set the conversation first. Let's start by trying to save our conversation. If conversation.save, and otherwise then we can just log a message for both of these conditions, if it's saved or not saved. So let's test this out. Click submit another message, try it out, and we are getting a issue saying that there is no local variable for recipient ID. So we can add that to our form as a hidden field. So let's do that. Recipient ID. And that would be the profile ID. I'm going to use Chrome DevTools just to have a look and see if we can find this field. And we can see here that it is being set correctly. And within our conversations controller, we can also set the sender ID. So that is going to be our current account. And we'll use the ID to pass in as the sender ID. And we're still not getting the result we want here yet. We're getting this recipient ID warning. Okay, we have a typo again. Quite a few typos in this video, unfortunately, but sometimes that's just how it is. So it's not able to save the connection or the conversation right now. So it is rolling back that create command. So let's go back and have a look at our controller code. Something we forgot to add up until now is the validation for the message model. So let's add some validation here on some of the fields that we need. And we can also do the same for our conversation model. So we can also add the conversation ID to the list of fields we're validating in our message. A nice way to see exactly what the error is that's preventing a record being saved is to add the exclamation mark after the save, after the .save. So in this case, we can see at the bottom, record invalid, messages account must exist, messages account can't be blank, and the conversation can't be blank. So it seems like some of the values are not being set right now. In order for us to add an account ID to the message, we could do something like conversation.messages.first and set the account ID directly there. So that's going to be our current account again. So we could populate it this way, and to get around the conversation ID error that we had, we can just comment out this field from the validation. So I think the problem here is that it's trying to validate the presence of the field before the actual conversation has been saved itself. So let's try this once again. And this time we can see that it is working, so that's really good. So the conversation is saved and the message has been saved also. So going back to our browse controller, in here I want to change things around a little bit. So before we do the conversation.new, I want to detect if a conversation has already been created previously. So we have a method for this. The scope here is between, and we pass it into account IDs. So we're using the params ID, which is set as a variable of ID. And then we're using our own current account.id. So then within this conversation instance variable, we will say, we will add a check to see how many conversations have been loaded based on that previous command. And if it's more than 0, then we're going to load the first conversation. Otherwise, then we will load a new conversation, so that's conversation.new. So this way we will be updating a conversation or creating a new one. So this should just work out of the box, but we will set up a new partial for this to move our code into. So we'll call that new conversation. And now we will render that partial. So browse a new conversation. So I'm trying out this in the browser again, and we can see that the update method cannot be found for the conversation controller. So let's go and add that now. We just have the create method here currently. So I'm going to put this method together really quickly. I'll just copy this down. So if conversation saved, then we can add a respond to block here for JavaScript. So we will be running this method using JavaScript. So messages is it's going to be the messages from the conversation. So for the respond to, we'll say format, respond to do format, and then format.js, and we can move that inside. So this will load a JavaScript file. So back within our conversations controller, we can render a view once this has been saved, this conversation. So we'll render this conversation messages. And now let's create that view for our conversation messages. So this is going to be a JavaScript file. And what we needed to do here is basically take the messages that are attached to the conversation and put them into a div that we can send back to the browser. So we're updating the browser with the latest messages. So let's output the escaped JavaScript version of our view. So within this escaped JavaScript, we'll render a view. And that view is a partial in this case. So we're rendering browse/messages. We can also add a console log here just to see if this has been see if this file is being loaded correctly. So let's create our messages. This will be an HTML file which just outputs the messages to the screen. So we'll iterate over this. So this will be an array of entries here. So let's put this as a paragraph tag, and then we will say message.body. We can actually use a simple format helper. So this will output it as paragraph tags for us. So now we just need to create this div to put these messages into. So we'll add that just above our new conversation partial. So this conversation div will be populated. This should actually be up in the main body area of this conversation window. And while we're here, let's just wrap something around this initial message that the user sees. And the reason for that is that if the conversation has been started previously and you're coming back to see this conversation again, you don't want to see that welcome message again. So we will be hiding that. But also once we post the message, we want to hide that view, or hide that welcome message. So we can do that from our JavaScript by just calling the .hide using jQuery. So we're just hiding that. So let's test this out now. And it looks here like our account ID isn't being set in the messages. So we can copy this line and move it down and see if that helps. And again, there's still an issue here. We need to change a couple of things in our controller method actually. When I was actually debugging this, I did lose a little bit of the video footage. So what I've changed here is a conversation.find. So we're actually finding that conversation and loading it first. And then we're running a method called conversation.update here. So we're running the update. That's pretty much boilerplate code from Rails, but when I was writing this code, it was quite late at night, and somehow I just completely missed it. But anyway, we have gone ahead and changed that, and we're adding a hidden field here to the form. So this is under the messages, the nested attributes for messages. So we're adding our own account ID in there. Now there is some other ways to approach that. We could do something here like a merge on the params. So we could run a params.merge and input our account ID that way. But for simplicity here, I'm just going to have it in the form. So aside from that, I'm making a quick change here to catch the case where the conversation has not been updated. So we can have some logic there to handle a scenario for that. So now once this conversation message is created, it should hide this welcome message, and then it should input the messages for that conversation into the div for conversation messages. Now I noticed a mistake here in the naming, so this conversation messages should just be messages, but other than that, this should be working. So let's try this out now. And we can see all the messages that we've already created in past attempts. So these will need styled up, but I think that's something that we can leave until the next video. So this video has gone on a bit longer than intended, but hopefully you guys have found it helpful. And if you're interested in learning more about Ruby on Rails, do check out my course link in the description below. And if you have enjoyed this content, do remember to like and subscribe to the channel. And other than that, I will see you guys in the next video.